be praying for them, and also Robbie's family for tomorrow's service. Yes, they mentioned that over there. I was talking with one of them. So, any others that you have? Tim McGuire. Any others? No others? All right. You probably need to probably need to pray for Terry. He's going to ride with me tomorrow down to High Point for Robbie's funeral. So, riding with the pastor is always an interesting time. Just ask Larry. He rode with me to the hospital a couple times, and yeah. Remember this? Larry swore he would never ride with me again. So, no. Well, tonight, as I said, we're not in a series right now, but we are having just regular Bible study tonight, and we are talking about stumbling blocks and removing those rocks from the path that could cause us to stumble. And so tonight, I want you to turn with me to Romans 14. We're going to be in verse 13, and we're going to read it, and this is just really just setting the stage for us on the direction of tonight's message and tonight's study. And while you're turning to Romans chapter 14, I will do a little plug for our next study that we'll be starting 2 weeks from tonight. Next week is homecoming, and we won't have any evening services next Sunday, but the following Sunday on the 27th, we're going to start a new Bible study topic, or a new Bible study on cults. Okay, so I'm going to try and get you signed up for one. All right, you can laugh a little bit. Okay, all right, but we're going to be we're going to be looking at three different religious organizations. Let's put it that way. And two of them we're going to flat out from the beginning tell you these are cults. Okay, and I'm not. It's Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. Okay, I'm not going. It's not like I'm going to surprise you the night you show up. But there is a third group that we're going to look at, and we're going to take what we've learned about cults from the first two and then apply it to this third one, and then we're going to make a determination whether we believe that they are a true Christian denomination or whether they are a cult. And so we're going to, it's sort of a self-study as we go along, but I'm looking forward to us starting with the Jehovah's Witnesses because this is definitely a God thing. I think it's just everything is a God thing, really. But this one just sort of sticks out to you. And a couple of weeks ago, at home, I received a letter in the mail. It was addressed to me on the front. Nicholas Wilson had my address, everything, and then in the top corner there was just a return address from a community on this side. Because this is going out on the internet, I'm not saying, giving too much information, but it was from a community on this side of the river, down the road here, that direction. And so I get this letter, and I'm like, why? Church members would just give me a letter at church, or it would come to the church. I'm like, but it was just to my name and my address. So I open it up, and it was a letter from a Jehovah's Witness. So just COVID has not slowed them down, and I don't mean that in a bad way. They are still proselytizing and witnessing, if you want to call it that, even despite the virus. And so I get this letter, and they're essentially encouraging me to check out a website or ask more questions. And one of the things that I'm going to teach you in our series on Jehovah's Witnesses, one of the final things we will talk about in the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons is how to talk to them about Jesus. And there's certain things that you have to understand about them before you try and share the gospel with them, because there's some things that will immediately get you shut down. And so what I did was I took what I know to be how you start to try and share the gospel with someone who is a Jehovah's Witness, and I wrote them back. And so I wrote them. I typed up a letter and wrote just wrote back that I'd read the letter and appreciated it and all of this. Now I didn't tell them that I was a minister or that anything like that, but I did say I had a Christian background, and I read, and I'll share the letter with you when we get to that point. But I sent them back. I'm waiting on my response. But I'm like checking the mail every day, like a kid looking for a birthday card or something. I'm like, come on, send me a letter so I can send you something back. But it's a matter of trying to witness to them, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about when we do this series. Is more than just, hey, this is what they believe, and this is how it compares to what we believe, but this is how you reach them for Christ. And so this is one of my favorite series to try to teach because of the impact it can have. Because we have Jehovah's Witnesses come to our door from time to time. Misty and I hadn't lived in our house that we live in now. We hadn't lived there probably 2 or 3 months, and we had 2 Mormons show up at our door. I've never had a Mormon visit me at my house. I never have in nearly 20 years of marriage. But they came to our house because the lady that had lived there before had been receptive to their material and talking with them about stuff. And so it is an opportunity to share Christ with them. And so we have to be proactive about it. And so that starts, the cult study starts 2 weeks from tonight. And so looking forward to digging into that. And so tonight, though, we are talking about stumbling blocks, okay? And so let's look at Romans 14:13, and we're going to read it, and it's just going to sort of, as I said, set the path for us for tonight. It says, "Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in your brother's way." So Paul is writing to the Romans and does a great job of just, Paul was one of those that just told you like it was. No beating around the bush, no sugarcoating it. He just told you how things were. And he tells right here, he's just like, look, quit passing judgment and make up your mind not to put stumbling blocks or things that are going to be an obstacle to other people in their way. He's just matter of fact. And so it makes you wonder what kind of problems they were having in the church in Rome that he had to put this into the letter that would be sent to them. So obviously there were some in the church in Rome, and as we'll see in a little bit, definitely in the church in Corinth, that were doing things that were causing others to stumble, causing newer Christians or even weaker Christians in the faith to stumble. And so Paul is just trying to address it and be like, look, don't be doing this because it's causing more damage to the church than good. And so that's sort of the direction that we're going to be taking tonight with our study on stumbling blocks. When Cooper, my youngest son, when he was younger, when he was probably 7, 8 years old, he went through this stage, and we still aggravate him about it today. In our house, we still pick on him a little bit about it. But when he was probably 7 or 8 years old, he would be walking through a parking lot, like out here, flat, level ground, and he'd just fall down. He'd just fall down. There wasn't a rock. He didn't just, he's just walking along, and he'd just fall down. And there was like 3 or 4 times, I don't remember, in like a very short period, like within a week, that this happened. And me and Misty are like, does he have a brain tumor? What's going on? Is he losing his mobility? Is it, is he not grown into his frame? Is he getting taller or having a growth spurt or what? And we never figured out, he probably was dropped on his head a couple of times when he was a kid, but that wouldn't explain this. But nevertheless, we could never figure out what caused him to just be walking and he would just up and fall down. And so Drew's always quick to remind him that he's the one that falls down on flat ground, and that's sort of how we will pick and aggravate at each other. But if we had been hiking in the woods and he tripped over a root, you got a reason. Or if you stumble over a rock walking in the woods like that on a hiking trail, then that's something else. But this was just flat ground, and it was amazing to think that even the smallest thing that we couldn't even really figure out what was causing it could cause him to not only stumble, but to fall, and to fall hard as he did. But, sometimes those stumbling blocks that we run into in life, sometimes they're a small pebble. And then other times they're a huge rock in our path. But regardless of the size, stumbling blocks have the same effect. It's a hard fall that can leave us broken and hurting spiritually. And so it's important that we try and avoid those and avoid putting them in the paths of other people. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight, is first off identifying those stumbling blocks that could creep up in our path, but also how we should avoid placing those same stumbling blocks in the paths of other believers. So, if we want to grow in our faith and we want to help others to grow as well, then one thing we have to learn to do is to identify those stumbling blocks. And we have to keep in mind a certain perspective on this, because we may trip over stumbling blocks, we may trip over certain ones that are in front of us, or we may end up laying stumbling blocks in front of others, but either way, it's not a good situation. Whether we're the ones getting tripped up or it's our fellow brothers or sisters in Christ that are getting tripped up, either way, it's not good. Because how many of you have ever fallen and it was a good thing? How many of you have ever fell in your yard or got tripped up in the garden or tripped over a rug in the house or something like that and it was a good thing? None of us, right? None of us have ever tripped and fell and it was a good thing. Well, Misty when she fell in love with me, but that's a whole nother, that's a whole nother thing, right? You can laugh. She's not here, and I'm hoping that she's not watching this until I can at least get home and preface that. But nevertheless, it's not a good thing for us to trip and fall. It's never a good thing. And so what we want to start off looking at is how to identify these stumbling blocks. Because stumbling blocks in the Bible are defined really by the word that is used to describe them. In the Old Testament, and they have this for us on the screen, the Old Testament stumbling blocks are referred to in the Hebrew as mikshol, is what it is. And it's a Hebrew word that just means an object which causes one to stumble or fall. That's a pretty good definition of a stumbling block, right? I mean, something that causes one to stumble or fall. And, we see this particular word used in Leviticus, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and even 5 times in the book of Ezekiel. And things that were considered stumbling blocks to the Israelites, to the Jews, were things like silver and gold and idols and things that would be a stumbling block for them spiritually to keep them from pursuing God. They would get tripped up over these other things that would draw them away from God. So one way for us to look at a stumbling block is something that causes us to stumble or fall spiritually. So sort of like we do on Wednesday nights at times, I'm going to ask for some answers from you. And what are some of the things in life that we may stumble or fall over spiritually? It could still be silver and gold and idols, but what are some of those things that we could stumble over, get tripped up on spiritually today? Any thoughts? Getting our feelings hurt. Okay. Definitely. Anything else? All right. Depression and self-pity. What else? What are some other things we can stumble over? Definitely. Incorrect theology. Unfortunately, there is a lot of that out there. And, there's, sort of like was mentioned this morning in our deacons meeting talking about, how many self-help gurus and, people you can find on the internet to teach you things about the Bible or teach you spiritual matters. There's a whole lot out there that can cause a lot of problems. What else? What are some other things we can get tripped up over spiritually? Anything else that jumps out at you? Okay. Expectations concerning church, and about worship styles and all of this stuff. And I'm going to tell you this, this is as a pastor, it's kind of humorous. At the time, I wasn't a pastor; I was the youth pastor, so I wasn't in charge, so I could sit back and sort of watch this play out. But at Penelope, when I was the youth pastor there, our pastor decided that he was going to take the order of service out of the bulletin and just have information about announcements, and that's what we were going to do. And so I don't remember what led up to that decision. I don't remember why we actually went through with that, but you would be surprised. You would not believe how many people not having the order of service in the bulletin was a stumbling block for them. And, I mean, he got so many complaints. And, as a youth pastor, I'm like, this is a lesson learned, Nick. Don't, don't do this. But it was just one of those things that he did. And it was amazing to see how many people just had such a stumbling block over just the order of worship. Not that they didn't know what we were going to do, not that they didn't know we were going to sing a hymn and then take up the offering and do, it's like any other church where you usually follow the same order, but it was something like that. Whether it's worship style or who knows what in the church, people can get hung up on it and be tripped up very easily over it. Did somebody else say something a minute ago before? Attitudes of different people can definitely be attitudes of fellow believers. If we have a Christian who is, or a believer who has who just has a bad, sour, attitude all the time, that could be detrimental to a newer Christian who doesn't know that really, that's not the way you ought to be as a Christian. We ought to be, be at least joyous because of what God's done for us. Any other stumbling blocks that you can think of this evening? No. That pride is bigger than I am tall for most of us. If it's a stumbling block, it's a big one, but that is definitely a stumbling block. So you see, there's plenty of things that we can pick up on that can be a stumbling block for people or for believers as they're trying to grow, or even whether it's church related or just in the normal course of life. And so, we talked about what it looked like from the Old Testament perspective, but in the New Testament, there are actually two words that are used for stumbling block. And the first one is proskoma, which is a Greek word that has the same definition as mikshol. So it's basically an object that causes someone to trip and fall. But another word, scandalon, is in English is offense. That's what it means in the English. If you were to see the Greek word scandalon translated into our Bibles, it would be offense. And as you see there, it's also the idea that it's the stick of a trap to which the bait is attached, and which, when touched, springs the trap. And so it's, if you think about it, that's an interesting view of a stumbling block, is that it's the thing that causes you to get trapped. That's what a stumbling block on some level is, that if we get hung up on there not being a order of worship in the bulletin or something like that, if we get hung up on something like that, or someone's, pride in our own life or whatever it may be, we're trapped. That's really what it is. That stumbling block is what has caused us to be trapped. And so that's one view from the New Testament of what this idea of stumbling blocks are. Now, both of these terms that you see there on the screen from the Greek, both of those are used multiple places in the New Testament, including Romans, where our main verse comes from, but also 1 Corinthians and 1 Peter and Revelation. And things that are considered in the New Testament to be stumbling blocks include the cross of Christ, another believer's spiritual freedom, the Apostle Peter, Christ, whose life was different from the Jewish expectation. There were plenty of things that we can see, that would cause folks to stumble. More so, Jesus, when we think about him and his life being different than what the Jewish expectations of the Messiah were, we see him being a stumbling block for the nation of Israel. He's not being a stumbling block for Christians. And so we see that could be the case, but we see here that this other form of a stumbling block is something where we are trapped in a place that causes us trouble spiritually. That's what we're seeing through this idea of the New Testament lens of a stumbling block. So either way that you look at it, whether you look at it from an Old Testament perspective or a New Testament perspective, a stumbling block, or that offense, as it might be called, is something is something that affects us in our spiritual life and ultimately our relationship with God, and it affects it in a negative way. That's the big thing that we have to understand, is that whether it's a stumbling block in our life that we get caught up on or get tripped up on, or whether it's a stumbling block that we put in the path of someone else, it's negative either way. It's not going to end well, as we talked about earlier. But when it comes to identifying stumbling blocks, we should have two main goals. And the first one is this: we need to be able to identify stumbling blocks that affect us personally. Okay, that's crucial. I mean, we need to know what things trip us up so that we know how to avoid them. Because if we don't know what trips us up, how in the world are we going to avoid those things that are going to have negative spiritual impacts in our lives? You know, stumbling blocks are a lot like temptations, and that is it's those that affect us may not affect someone else. You know, what is a hang-up for us or a stumbling block for us in our spiritual life, it may not even be a second thought for someone else. You know, what I might get stumbling over, Rob may not even think twice about it. He may, it just completely isn't on his radar. And so we have to understand that stumbling blocks affect us each differently. You know, when my boys were younger, we used to do a lot of hiking. I mean, we did a lot of hiking. And when they were little, it wouldn't be uncommon for them to get tripped up over certain roots or rocks or things like that. But when Dad has a size 15 tennis shoe, I don't get tripped up over the same thing their little feet would. And what's the difference there? Dad is, well, physically mature. I'm not mentally mature most days, but I am physically mature over them, where they are smaller, and so that root that would easily trip them up because of the length of their legs and the size of their feet wasn't anything for me. I might even just step on it and just keep going. And so, it's that idea for us that what was a stumbling block for them wasn't even given consideration by me, because I just stepped right over it and just kept going. And so growing to be a more spiritually mature Christian involves identifying those stumbling blocks and those pitfalls of life that I know that I need to avoid because it's going to impact me. And not being concerned about, to some degree, the stumbling blocks of others, because what they're going to get stumbling over, they need to identify in their own life. But the other thing we need to do as far as a goal for this is to be able to identify stumbling blocks that we leave that affect others. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about the stumbling blocks of others, because if we are the ones leaving them for others because of things that we're doing, then we need to be sure to identify those things. I think we'd all agree that the last thing that we would ever want to do to or for another believer would be to cause them to fall spiritually, to cause them to get tripped up spiritually. I don't know of a Christian that would say that, yeah, I'm okay with me causing someone else to fall spiritually. And that's not even Christ-like. And, even though we don't want to do it, sometimes we leave stumbling blocks for other believers without even realizing it. And and we have to be on guard about that, so that we don't cause our brothers and sisters in Christ to get tripped up. What we have to do is we have to take stock of the influence and the witness that we have on those Christians and even on those non-believers that are around us, and be sure that we aren't leaving stumbling blocks in their path. I mean, think about it. Our witness to non-believers can leave a positive or a negative stumbling block, so to speak, in the negative context, a stumbling block in their path towards Christ. How many of us would want to be the one that caused someone to not want anything to do with Christ because, well, I saw the way that John dealt with people, I saw the way Ken treated people at work, or I saw how, whatever the case may be, I don't want anything to do with that Jesus. That's a stumbling block for someone who doesn't even know Christ. And so the last thing we would want to do is be that stumbling block or leave that stumbling block in front of someone so that they never even get to Christ. And so we have to, be sure that we're, taking stock of that. And we need to remember too that it isn't those that are more spiritually mature than us that we have to worry about causing to stumble. It's those that are weaker than us spiritually. And I don't mean that in a bad context. I'm just saying we all understand that there are Christians who are less mature and Christians that are more mature than us. Okay? If we are par, so to speak, in this scale that we're considering, there are going to be Christians who are newer in the faith than us and are not as far along in their walk with Christ than we are. And there are going to be some that are much more mature than us spiritually and are further down the road. It's the reality of the way faith and this works. And the ones that are more mature than us, we don't really, I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about putting stumbling blocks in their path, but more than likely, if they're more mature than us spiritually, they're going to overlook our faults, our problems that could cause a stumbling block. But the ones that are newer in the faith, the ones that are weaker spiritually, they're the ones that we have to worry about causing stumbling blocks in front of them. And that could be our children. That could be our grandchildren. That could be kids in our church. That could be teenagers in our church. It could be other adults that just aren't as far down the road as us. And we have to be careful about those stumbling blocks. But now that we know what to look for when it comes to stumbling blocks in our own path or those that we leave in the paths of others, I want us to consider some other aspects of stumbling blocks as well. And the first thing we need to consider is to avoid being a stumbling block. We need to avoid being that stumbling block in someone else's life. Now, when Jesus was starting to reveal to his disciples how he had to suffer and die and then be raised on the third day, as he was explaining this to them and starting to reveal to them essentially the plan of salvation, what happens is Peter pulls Jesus aside. He pulls him aside, and he does so, and and his whole purpose for doing so was to try and reason with Jesus and rebuke him from doing that. And that was his whole plan. Was he pulls Jesus, to the side. He's like, "Hey, Jesus, let's rethink this. You don't really need to do this. You don't really need to die. You don't really need to be raised, from the dead." And Matthew 16:23 shows us that even there we can become a stumbling block to others if our mind is not on the things of God. And that's what happened with Peter. His mind was not on the things of God the way Jesus was, and he was setting in or placing in front of Jesus a huge stumbling block. And it says that in verse 23, it says Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." And so Jesus is essentially telling Peter, look, you've got to get out of the way. You are a stumbling block to me and essentially to the plan of salvation. And so Jesus could have very easily have caved to his earthly nature. You remember, Jesus is 100% man and 100% God all at the same time. We don't know how all of that worked. We just know that's the fact of the matter. He was the glory of heaven, shrouded in human flesh. However we can make that work. But what we know is that Jesus was 100% man, 100% God, all at the same time, never losing his divinity. And in this moment, he could have caved to that human flesh and followed Peter's suggestion and said, "Okay, you're right, Peter. Let's not do this. There's really no reason for me to die." I mean, because there is not a human alive that wants to die and do that sort of thing. It just doesn't make sense. But for God's plan of salvation, it had to happen. And so Peter was in the way. He was becoming a stumbling block in Jesus' way. But instead, Jesus avoided that temptation and avoided becoming a stumbling block himself for humanity. Because had Jesus stumbled over Peter, think about the results. You and I would not be sitting here having this conversation tonight. Why would we? Because if Jesus didn't go through with the plan of salvation, if you want to look at it in that way, that he would die for our sins and be raised from the dead and ascend into heaven. If he had not done that, then there would be no reason for me to be teaching out of a book that tells you about that, because it wouldn't be telling us about that. Jesus falling over that stumbling block would have affected billions of people. Well, actually all of humanity, because humanity would not have been given an opportunity, so to speak, to have that salvation. So, it's pretty safe to say that stumbling blocks very rarely affect just one person. Peter's thinking of it from a selfish standpoint. Hey, if I can get Jesus not to do this, then he's going to be around, and we get to continue to have a relationship and do all of this. But Peter's not thinking about the things of God. He's thinking about the things of men. And so we must keep our minds on the things of God, and if we do so, we can avoid a lot of the situations in life where we may be a stumbling block to those around us. Colossians chapter 3, verse 2 reminds us, it says, set your mind on things above and not on earthly things. And if we do that, like Jesus is telling Peter that he wasn't doing that, but if we do that, we can avoid a lot of those situations that cause us to stumble. And the last thing we would want to do is to take our focus off of God and end up being the person that Jesus talks about in Matthew 18. In Matthew 18:7, this is what Jesus says. He says, "Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come." So Jesus is saying, I hate it for the world because of the stumbling blocks in the world, and they're going to come. There's no doubt that they're going to happen. We just need to know stumbling blocks are going to come. But then he says this, "But woe to that man through whom the stumbling block comes." Jesus is saying, you don't want to be the guy leaving stumbling blocks. You don't want to be the guy who is, or the girl, or the woman who is a stumbling block. And Jesus is saying that's not what you want to do. And so something else that we see when it comes to stumbling blocks is that we also need to avoid placing stones in other people's paths. Paul must have regularly witnessed situations in the various churches where believers were setting stumbling blocks in the paths of others, because he wrote more to the churches of Rome and the churches of Rome and Corinth than any others on this subject. So there must have just been some folks in Corinth and some folks in Rome that just did not get a clue when it come to the idea of stumbling blocks. And so can you imagine Paul's just like, I wish they would just listen to me. He's just having to write it over and over and over. It seems like he's trying to address this with these particular individuals. But he wrote about this quite a bit. But the easiest and most common way we place stumbling blocks in the paths of others is when we exercise our spiritual freedom in a way that affects those who are weaker spiritually. Again, those that are not as far down the path, less spiritually mature. 1 Corinthians 8:9 speaks right to the heart of this matter. It says this, again, in the Corinthian letter. It says, "Be careful, however, that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak." For us as modern-day Christians, that's something that we need to be very mindful of, is that we're not exercising some level of spiritual freedom because of our spiritual maturity, and it caused a stumbling block for someone who's not as far down the road as us in the faith. Corinth was a melting pot. Corinth was this crossroads where east met west, and it was just a literal melting pot of cultures and religions at the time of Paul. It just was. But one thing that was a concern of those in the church was how some more mature Christians would eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols, and how that negatively affected those who were weaker spiritually. So you've got to imagine, okay, they're sitting at this meal, and there are younger Christians and older Christians. And when I say younger, I mean more mature and less mature Christians. Let me be more technical here. So you've got this, this big spread, this big banquet, and they're enjoying this meal together, and there are Christians who are more mature and some that are less mature. And the ones that are more mature realize idols are nothing more than stones and pieces of metal and precious metals and things like that, pieces of wood. That's all they are. This meat that's been sacrificed and prepared for the idols, it's just a cheeseburger. I'm going to eat it. So that's sort of their mentality. So they're just going to eat the meat. It doesn't affect them because they don't believe in the idols. They don't, they know that it's nonsense, and they're just going to enjoy the meal. But there are other Christians who are less spiritually mature, and they're sitting at the table too, and they're watching, the more mature Christian on the other end, he's just chowing down, and just eating the meat and not even thinking anything of it. And they're looking at him, and they're like, "No, wait a minute. What? They shouldn't be doing that. Do they believe in this idol?" And and it's causing them to stumble. It's causing them to have problems because they're not as far down the road spiritually as the more mature ones are. And yes, could it be solved with a simple conversation? Yes. But does that mean that the weaker or less mature Christian is immediately just going to understand it and follow it and just go with it blindly because this more mature Christian has said that? No, that's not how it works. They have to grow in their faith. They have to study the scriptures. They have to, mature in a certain way. And, Paul's admonition was that more mature Christians who knew that there was no idol, to which the sacrifice had been made, they must not allow their understanding that there was no real idol to cause the weaker Christians to question or even fall away from their faith. And that's what Paul's trying to get them to understand is, look, there is, it's like, with great power comes great responsibility, so to speak. Well, in the Christian faith, with more maturity comes great responsibility. We have to be responsible when it comes to the spiritual freedom that we exercise as more mature Christians in front of those that are not as mature in the faith. And nowadays, if we were to have a homecoming meal next week, which we unfortunately can't have this year, if we were to have a homecoming meal next week, we're not going to see meat that has been sacrificed to idols. It's just one of those things that's not normally on the menu of a Baptist church's homecoming meal. But, we don't see those things, so it's not something that could be a stumbling block for us today. But something that can be is the use of alcohol, okay? And I use that. I'm not putting down someone who uses it. If they choose to use it, that's their prerogative. That's between them and God, okay? Personally, I think it ought to be left alone, but that's just me, okay? When your grandfather is an alcoholic or you've been impacted in that way, it sort of colors you in a certain direction. And so that's where I'm going to say that much. But what I'm saying, though, is when it comes to the use of alcohol, that's an easy one for us, even today, for us to see how that can be impacting the lives of less mature Christians. If a more mature Christian who has spiritual freedom and has come to terms with their use of alcohol between them and God, and they've studied the scriptures and they've grown in their faith to a place where they're okay with it, okay? For that Christian who does not have the same level of maturity, that could be a stumbling block for them, and a major stumbling block, depending on what their view of it is and what their understanding of the scriptures is and things like that. And so we have to understand that it can be something like alcohol. It could be something different, okay? That's just an easy example for us to use. But there are a lot of things that we have to remember, that there is a lot of responsibility that we as more mature Christians have. There's a lot of responsibility we have when it comes to the witness and the impact that we can have on less mature Christians. So the final thing that we are going to talk about tonight is about how we need to avoid stumbling blocks at all costs. That is really the heart of tonight's message for us to really understand, because we've discussed, what kind of trouble stumbling blocks cause, either for ourselves or for other believers. And I want to leave you with this last bit of pastoral counsel or whatever you want to know, or however you want to define it, on stumbling blocks. But the best thing we can do is just to avoid them altogether. Avoid them in our life and avoid leaving them for others. Jesus figuratively gives us advice on the lengths we should go to avoid stumbling blocks. And remember, Jesus is giving us a figurative example, not a literal example. But in Matthew 18, verses 8 and 9, he says this. He says, "If your hand or foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be cast into the eternal fire. If your eyes cause you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be cast into the fiery hell." And so what Jesus is doing, think about it, that sounds pretty drastic. We're going to cut off a hand or, pluck out an eye. But what Jesus is trying to get us to realize is the extent that we ought to go to when it comes to removing stumbling blocks or keeping from placing them in the paths of others. No, we shouldn't literally go and cut off our hand or pluck out our eye, but what he is saying is that we should go to extreme measures, so to speak, go to a great extent to keep from placing those stumbling blocks in the paths of others. He's basically teaching us that radical changes are oftentimes necessary when avoiding those things that can cause us to stumble and fall. And you got to remember that what we're talking about is not only our own spiritual well-being and our own spiritual maturity and our own spiritual growth and our faith, but we're also talking about the faith of people that are around us, those that we would impact, whether it's our children or our friends or coworkers or whoever it may be. We have to make sure that our radical changes to avoid stumbling blocks, first off, don't violate another part of Scripture, but it also keeps us from becoming a stumbling block for another member of the body of Christ. And so it's important that we do everything we can to avoid those stumbling blocks and avoid putting those in the paths of other believers. And so that is tonight's lesson on stumbling blocks. And so I hope that it has encouraged you in some way in your own walk with Christ to either avoid those stumbling blocks or avoid putting them in the paths of other believers. And so, as I said, next time we're together on a Sunday night, we're going to be able to start into our series on Jehovah's Witnesses. That Sunday morning, that Sunday morning after homecoming, the 27th, we're actually going to start into the I am sayings of Jesus. And so we're going to be looking at several weeks of the sayings of Jesus where he says, I am the vine, or I am, the gate or the door. And so we'll be looking at those for a few weeks in the coming months. And so with that being said, I'm going to ask Dennis if he'll close us with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed.